Josef Fritzl built a secret cellar beneath his home and locked his own daughter inside. For 24 years, the world believed she had vanished, while just meters away, she lived in darkness, gave birth to 7 children, and endured horrors no one could imagine. This is the hidden life of Elisabeth Fritzl, a story of deception, captivity, and survival that would shock the world the day the truth finally broke through the concrete walls of that cellar. A predator in plain sight, Josef Fritzl was born in 1935 in the quiet Austrian town of Amstetten. His childhood was anything but gentle. His father, a heavy drinker and often absent, abandoned the family when Josef was just 4 years old. He would never see him again. The war soon claimed what little connection remained. Josef's father was killed in combat in 1944, his name etched on a memorial plaque in Amstetten, while his son grew up in the shadow of neglect. That left Josef alone with his mother, Maria. By his account, her discipline was brutal. Neighbors described her as severe, and Josef himself later admitted that she ruled with fists and harsh words more than affection. Childhood for him meant survival, not safety. By 1956, at just 21 years old, Josef married a local girl, Rosemarie, who was only 17. Together, they built a large family, 7 children in total. But behind closed doors, life in the Fritzl household was not the portrait of a typical Austrian family. Elisabeth, born in 1966, would one day become central to one of the most disturbing cases the world has ever heard of. Because Josef was not just a husband and father, he was also an engineer, a businessman, and a landlord who outwardly appeared successful, even respectable. He had studied electrical engineering, worked in industry, and managed properties. In 1972, he even purchased a guest house near Lake Mondsee, where families came to relax, unaware of the man quietly running it. But beneath that veneer of normality, Josef Fritzl was already revealing the darker side of his character. By the late 1970s, he began preying on his own daughter. Elisabeth was just 11 years old when, according to her later testimony, her father first crossed an unthinkable line. What began then would escalate into something monstrous, an ordeal hidden away for decades, just beneath the surface of this quiet Austrian town. In 1967, the mask slipped. Josef Fritzl was no longer just a stern husband or an ambitious landlord. That year, he forced his way into the home of a young nurse in Linz. She was only 24 years old, married, and alone that evening when he pressed a knife to her throat and abused her. He told her that if she screamed, he would kill her. And this wasn't an isolated act. Around the same time, police suspected him in the attempted abuse of another young woman, just 21, and in repeated incidents of indecent exposure. Josef was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 18 months in prison. He served only 12. But Austria in the 1960s had laws that offered second chances to even its most violent offenders. 15 years later, his criminal record was wiped clean. Officially, it was as though the abuse and assaults had never happened. Decades later, when Fritzl applied to foster and adopt children, including some who would later turn out to be his own grandchildren, social workers searching his file saw nothing. The system itself had erased his past. By the 1980s, whispers began to grow darker. In November 1986, 17-year-old Martina Posch left her home in Upper Austria to catch a bus. She never arrived. 10 days later, 2 divers discovered her body on the southern shore of Lake Mondsee. She had been strangled and wrapped in olive green tarpaulins. The discovery was chilling enough on its own, but the location raised even more suspicion. At that very time, Josef Fritzl and his wife were managing a campground directly across from where Martina's body was found. Investigators noted the disturbing coincidence. Martina looked strikingly similar to Fritzl's daughter, Elisabeth. Authorities also re-examined other unsolved murders. Anna Neumeier, just 17, killed with a captive bolt pistol in 1966. Gabriela Supakova, a 42-year-old escort, found dead in 2007 when Fritzl happened to be on holiday nearby. Each case hinted at a pattern. Each tied him, if only by circumstance, to women who ended up dead. Yet no charges were ever brought. The evidence wasn't enough, and so Fritzl remained free, a predator hiding in plain sight. The basement prison. Before the cellar, before the years underground, Elisabeth's relationship with her father was already marked by control. Those who knew the family described Josef as strict and domineering, a man who expected his children to obey without question. Elisabeth grew up under his rules, living in a household where his word was law. To outsiders, there were few obvious cracks, but in private, the signs were there. Friends remembered her as reserved, reluctant to speak about her home life. One of her boyfriends from her teenage years recalled her as serious and withdrawn, someone who pulled away from intimacy. He said Elisabeth once admitted her father was very strict, forbidding her from spending time with male friends. According to him, she had even been punished simply for talking to boys. In mid-1984, when her parents came to collect her, she wasn't even allowed to say goodbye. By the age of 17, Elisabeth was already searching for ways out. She trained as a waitress, and in early 1983 she tried to disappear altogether, hiding in Vienna with a friend. For 3 weeks, she managed to slip beyond her father's reach, until police tracked her down and returned her to Amstetten. She went back to her course, graduated, and even secured a job offer in Linz. For a brief time, it seemed she was beginning to carve out a life of her own. That illusion ended on August 28, 1984. Elisabeth was 18 when her father asked for help with a simple task: carrying a door into the basement. What she didn't know was that he had been constructing a hidden chamber beneath their home, and the door she was holding was the final piece. When she steadied it in the frame, he pressed a towel soaked in ether against her face. She lost consciousness, and when she woke again, she was locked inside the prison her father had built. To the outside world, Elisabeth had vanished. Her mother reported her missing, but weeks later a letter arrived, written in Elisabeth's hand and postmarked from Braunau. The message claimed she had grown tired of family life, that she was living with friends, and that her parents should not look for her. Josef explained to police that she must have joined a cult. It was plausible enough to stall suspicion. For the next 24 years, he descended into that basement almost daily. He abused Elisabeth relentlessly, sometimes several times a week. She gave birth to 7 children in the underground chamber. 1 died shortly after birth. 3 were carried upstairs as infants and presented to authorities as abandoned children left on the family's doorstep. Social workers visited regularly, accepted Josef's explanations without question, and even approved him and his wife as foster parents. No one ever asked what was behind the heavy door beneath the house. The house in Amstetten was ordinary on the outside. Built in the late 1800s, it looked like any other aging property in the quiet Austrian town. But in the late 1970s, Fritzl filed for a permit to add an extension with a basement. Inspectors came, signed off on the work, and left. What they didn't see was how he'd already gone beyond the approved plans. Hidden behind freshly built walls, he had begun carving out a space that no one else would ever be allowed to enter. By the early 1980s, the project was no longer just a basement. It was a prison. Fritzl installed a wash basin, a toilet, a bed, a hot plate, and a refrigerator. He dug passageways connecting the new addition to the old foundations of the house, creating a network that only he knew existed. The finished chamber covered about 55 square meters, divided into sections: a corridor 5 meters long, a storage area, 3 small open cells, a cramped cooking area, and 2 sleeping rooms with narrow beds. The layout was designed for concealment, not comfort. Access was through doors that were as heavy as they were forbidding. One hinge slab of steel and concrete weighed more than half a ton. Another, mounted on rails and reinforced with concrete, was so small it forced anyone passing through to crouch to a crawl. Barely 1 meter high and 60 centimeters wide. To get to it, a person had to cross 5 separate basement rooms, each locked before reaching the shelf in Fritzl's workshop that hid the entrance. Behind it, an electronic code activated the final barrier. In total, 8 doors had to be opened before reaching the space where Elisabeth and her children were held. It was less a home than a bunker, a fortress built to erase lives while hiding in plain sight. And for 24 years, it worked. In 1994, after the 4th child was born, Josef expanded the cellar. He forced Elisabeth and her children to claw at the soil with their bare hands until the cramped 35 square meters had grown to 55. There was a television, a small refrigerator, a stove. Elisabeth taught her children to read and write by the dim glow of a screen. But food was rationed, and punishment could be swift. Sometimes he cut the power. Sometimes he left them in darkness without food for days. He told them there were gas lines installed, that any attempt to escape would release poison into the air. He warned that the door was wired with electricity and would kill them if they touched it. Later investigations proved those threats were lies, tools meant only to control through fear. Josef's family upstairs lived around his patterns. Every morning at 9, he disappeared into the basement, telling his wife he was drawing machine plans for clients. He often stayed there overnight. She wasn't allowed to bring him coffee. A tenant who rented a room for 12 years later admitted he sometimes heard voices and noises from below. Josef explained them away as faulty pipes or the heating system. And for 24 years, everyone believed him. The fall of Josef Fritzl. April 19, 2008, the secret beneath Josef Fritzl's home began to unravel. Kirsten, Elisabeth's eldest daughter, collapsed inside the cellar, her condition worsening until even Fritzl could no longer deny she needed help. For the first time in 24 years, Elisabeth stepped outside, helping him carry her unconscious daughter into the daylight. The moment was brief. He forced her back down into the chamber, but it marked the beginning of the end. Kirsten was rushed by ambulance to the Landesklinikum Amstetten Hospital, admitted in critical condition with kidney failure. Fritzl followed later, telling doctors he had found a note written by the girl's mother. He said Elisabeth was living in a cult, that she couldn't come forward herself. But something in his story didn't sit right with the staff. By April 21st, the police were alerted. They appealed publicly for Elisabeth to come forward with her daughter's medical history, and they reopened the investigation into her disappearance. Fritzl stuck to his story, even producing another letter supposedly written by Elisabeth months earlier. Experts who examined it noticed how stilted and dictated the words seemed. The cult Fritzl described was likely a fiction. Inside the cellar, Elisabeth begged him to let her see her daughter. A week later, on April 26th, he relented. He brought her and 2 of her sons upstairs. Together, they went to the hospital. When the attending physician recognized the family and tipped off authorities, police moved quickly. They detained Josef and Elisabeth on the hospital grounds and took them in for questioning. At first, Elisabeth said nothing. She had endured too much, and she feared what might happen if her father was returned to her. Only after police promised she would never see him again did she begin to speak. For 2 hours, she recounted the story of her captivity, the abuses, the beatings, the humiliation, she told investigators how her father forced her to watch pornographic films, then reenact them in front of her children. Fritzl was 73 years old when he was arrested on suspicion of abuse, incest, and enslavement. That same night, Elisabeth, her children, and her mother Rosemarie were taken into protective care. Investigators entered the house through a concealed door, unlocked by a secret electronic code, and found the chambers that had held Elisabeth for more than 2 decades. Rosemarie, stunned, had known nothing. On April 29th, DNA evidence confirmed what Elisabeth had already said. Josef Fritzl was the biological father of her children. His lawyer tried to soften the blow, admitting the DNA proved incest, but insisting that charges of abuse and enslavement still required proof. Police, meanwhile, revealed that Fritzl had forced Elisabeth to write another letter in 2007, hinting that she might be allowed to come home. They believed he was preparing to stage her release and claim he had rescued her from the cult he had invented. By May, investigators were preparing to question more than 100 people who had lived as tenants in the Fritzl home over the past 24 years. A second life in the basement. In July 2008, Elisabeth gave her testimony to prosecutors. It was recorded on video, under the condition that she would never have to face her father again. 4 months later, on November 13th, Josef Fritzl was formally indicted. The charges were staggering: murder for the death of the infant Michael, who had died shortly after birth in the cellar, along with abuse, incest, kidnapping, false imprisonment, and slavery. Conviction carried the possibility of life in prison. Fritzl, even after his arrest, refused to call what he had done abuse. In conversations with his lawyer, he claimed the assaults had been consensual, as though his daughter had a choice. He told investigators that for 24 years he knew it was wrong, that he must have been crazy, but that it became normal to live what he called a second life in the basement. He rejected the image of himself as a monster, insisting he brought flowers, toys, and books into the bunker, that he sometimes ate meals and watched videos with Elisabeth and the children. His reasoning for her imprisonment was as twisted as it was revealing. He said Elisabeth had stopped adhering to rules as a teenager, and so he needed to take control. He described building a place to keep her away from the world, by force if necessary. At times, he pointed to the atmosphere of discipline in Austria during the Nazi annexation as an influence on his ideas of order and behavior. Observers suspected this was less explanation than strategy, a way to lay the groundwork for an insanity defense. His own childhood story shifted over time. At first, he called his mother the best woman in the world, strict but necessary. Later, he described her as violent and cruel, beating him until he bled, calling him names, leaving him desperate for affection. He admitted he grew up afraid of her. When she moved into his home in 1959, the roles reversed. Fritzl came to dominate her, eventually confining her to the attic and bricking up her window. To neighbors, he said she had died. In truth, she remained locked away until her death in 1980. How long she lived in that captivity has never been certain. Forensic psychiatrist Adelheid Kastner examined Fritzl after his arrest and concluded he suffered from a severe combined personality disorder with borderline, schizotypal, and schizoid traits, as well as a sexual disorder. She recommended psychiatric treatment for the rest of his life. Fritzl himself admitted that his behavior had been premeditated. He described himself as an alibi child, born only to prove his mother's fertility, and said his pathology was innate. He admitted that, while serving his earlier abuse sentence decades before, he had already begun planning to lock his daughter away. "I was born to abuse," he told examiners. "I could have behaved a lot worse than locking up my daughter." Later reports confirmed what Elisabeth had always known. The cellar had never been about discipline, nor about control alone. It had been constructed for his gratification, for a fantasy that lasted nearly a quarter of a century. The trial of Josef Fritzl, opened on March 16, 2009, in the city of St. Polten. He walked into the courtroom shielding his face behind a blue folder, a right allowed under Austrian law. Cameras flashed, shutters clicked, and then the room was cleared. Journalists and spectators were ushered out. Only then did he lower the folder and face the court. He admitted guilt to nearly every charge except two: the murder of his infant grandson Michael, and grievous assault for threatening to gas his captives. His defense lawyer urged the jury to see him as more than the headlines. He claimed Fritzl was not a monster, pointing to the times he had carried a Christmas tree into the cellar for the children. The prosecution countered with a different picture. Chief Prosecutor Christiane Burkheiser, trying her first case in the role, demanded life imprisonment in a psychiatric institution. She recreated the reality of the cellar for the jury, marking the low ceiling height on the courtroom door at barely 5 feet 8, passing around musty objects taken from the underground rooms. The smell of mold filled the air, making jurors recoil. Jurors were then shown 11 hours of Elisabeth's videotaped testimony, recorded the previous summer. The footage was so devastating that they could only watch in short stretches. 4 alternates waited outside, ready to step in if anyone broke down. For the first time, the court heard in her own words what she had lived through: the abuses, the humiliations, the births, the fear. Her brother Harold testified too, describing the physical abuse he had suffered as a child. Rosemarie, Fritzl's wife, refused to testify, as did Elisabeth's children. On March 18th, Elisabeth herself came to court. Disguised, she entered the gallery as her testimony was played. When Fritzl realized she was there, watching him, he turned pale. His lawyer later described it as the moment his defenses crumbled. The next morning, Fritzl changed his pleas. He admitted guilt to every charge. On March 19, 2009, Josef Fritzl was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for 15 years. He accepted the decision without appeal. Today, he serves his sentence in Garston Abbey, a former monastery converted into a prison. The case had left Austria reeling. In 2008, before the trial even began, Chancellor Alfred Gusenbauer had spoken of launching a campaign to restore the country's public image after what he called abominable events. For many, the trial was not only about one man's crimes, but about a system that had allowed those crimes to remain hidden, festering in silence for nearly a quarter of a century. After the rescue, Judge Andrea Humer confirmed that medical experts had found Elisabeth and her children in relatively good health, at least compared to what might have been expected. They were taken into protective care at a local clinic, where doctors and psychologists tried to help them rebuild lives that had been stunted and distorted by 2 decades underground. There, they were shielded from the outside world and offered new identities, though the choice of whether to accept them was left to the family. The long road of recovery. The recovery was not simple. Doctors reported that the children who had grown up in the cellar needed therapy just to adjust to natural light, after years in semi-darkness. They also had to learn to cope with open space. Kirsten, after weeks in a medically induced coma, was reunited with her family in June 2008 and would recover physically. But signs of trauma ran deep. She had torn out her hair during captivity, shredded her own clothes, and stuffed them down the toilet. Stefan, forced to grow taller than the ceiling that contained him, emerged unable to walk properly, his spine shaped by confinement. Both suffered panic attacks triggered by ordinary things, lights dimming, doors closing. The children raised upstairs by Josef were also scarred. They carried anger and resentment, not only for what had been done to their mother and siblings, but for the lies they had been raised on. They had been told Elisabeth abandoned them. Now they learned the truth. In May 2008, as they began therapy, Elisabeth, her children, and her mother created a handmade poster of thanks displayed in the Amstetten town center. "Your compassion is helping us greatly," it read. "We hope that soon there will be a time where we can find our way back into a normal life." It was a rare glimpse of hope amid the devastation. But fractures remained. Elisabeth soon ordered her mother out of the safe house arranged by doctors, unable to forgive Rosemarie's passivity during her own childhood. And the family's attempt at normalcy was shattered in March 2009, when a British paparazzo burst into their kitchen and began taking photographs. Elisabeth, already fragile, was said to be close to a breakdown. Eventually, Elisabeth and her 6 surviving children were relocated to an unnamed village in northern Austria, in a fortress-like house. All continued to receive therapy. The children who had lived upstairs struggled with betrayal. The ones raised underground struggled with deprivation and the lifelong effects of abuse. None of them would ever return to an ordinary life, untouched by what happened beneath that house in Amstetten. For Austria and for the world, the case left questions that were never fully answered. How could neighbors, officials, and social workers have missed so much? How could one man hide his crimes for so long behind so many doors, in the heart of a town that never thought to look closer? And for Elisabeth and her children, the challenge became something more enduring than survival. It was learning how to live again in the sunlight, after so many years in the dark. Even as Elisabeth and her children built their fragile new lives, the shadow of what had happened in Amstetten never fully faded. Every interview, every book, every film adaptation reminded them that their private suffering had become a public narrative. The story of Josef Fritzl was told and retold across the world, sometimes with accuracy, sometimes sensationalized, but always orbiting around the same unimaginable fact. A father had hidden his daughter and grandchildren beneath the ground for nearly a quarter of a century. For Austria, the case became a reckoning. Questions spread beyond Amstetten. How had inspectors missed the illegal basement extensions? How had social workers accepted 3 abandoned babies without suspicion? How had neighbors ignored decades of strange noises, dismissing them as faulty pipes? The systemic failures were undeniable. Laws were scrutinized, oversight tightened, and the country's self-image as a safe, orderly society was shaken. For Elisabeth, though, the focus was never on politics or reputation. Her work was survival, teaching her children to reclaim the simplest experiences of ordinary life. The warmth of daylight on their skin, the feel of grass under bare feet, the ability to close a door at night without fear of it ever locking from the outside. Josef Fritzl remains locked away, his name changed but his crimes indelible. His health deteriorates, his memory fades, but the record of what he did cannot be erased. Elisabeth and her children live on. They carry the weight of what was stolen from them, but they also carry something Fritzl never anticipated: resilience. Their lives are not defined by the cellar alone, but by the decision to step out of it and continue forward together. And that is where this story truly ends. Not with the man who built walls of concrete and lies, but with the woman who survived them. Where are they now? In the years since the verdict, Austria has continued to keep watch on the man who built the cellar and the family who survived it. Courts have reviewed Josef's confinement many times. By 2024, at 88 and reportedly suffering from dementia, he was moved from psychiatric detention into a regular prison, a step that technically made parole petitions possible. He applied for early release into a nursing home, but was denied. He remains under life sentence, frail and aging behind walls of his own. The house in Amstetten, once an ordinary building hiding extraordinary horror, was sealed in 2013 when workers filled the cellar with concrete. Neighbors argued whether it should be demolished entirely. Instead, it was sold and converted into apartments, a new layer built atop history that cannot be erased. Elisabeth and her 6 surviving children live quietly under new identities in a secluded Austrian village. They are shielded from attention, though occasional reports describe them forging normal routines, swimming, shopping, building sibling bonds, and reclaiming a life outside confinement. Elisabeth is said to have found companionship with one of her former bodyguards, and together they focus on raising her children beyond the shadow of the cellar. The case of Josef Fritzl is more than a story about one man's cruelty. It is about what can hide in plain sight. For nearly a quarter of a century, an ordinary house in a quiet Austrian town concealed a secret that no one wanted to imagine possible. A daughter vanished, and a father's lies went unquestioned. Systems meant to protect failed at every step. Elisabeth's survival is a testament to strength in the face of unimaginable darkness. She raised children, taught them to read, kept them alive, and held on to hope when the world above thought she was gone. Her endurance and the resilience of her children stand in contrast to the cowardice and deceit that kept them hidden for so long. For Austria and for the world, the Fritzl case is a reminder that evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it builds walls, hides behind ordinary facades, and relies on silence to thrive. The horror of what happened in Amstetten cannot be undone, but remembering it, confronting how it happened, is the only way to ensure it cannot be repeated.